Are you a leader, manager, entrepreneur, business owner, or knowledge worker? Are you leading people or wondering how to be a better leader in your own life and work? If you are, then you can be experimenting better. Welcome to The Experimental Leader, a podcast that takes a look at the ways leaders are experimenting in their own work. Hosted by Melanie Parish, we dive into real-life conversations about how people might be using a scientist's mindset and experimenting in their work. Shift your leadership into something that works better. Join us on The Experimental Leader today.
Hello, I am so excited to have you here on my show, The Experimental Leader podcast. I'm Melanie Parish, and this is our Pride Show. So it is great to be here with you. And I have some very special guests today. The first is actually my husband, Mel Rutherford. And I want to tell you a little bit about Mel. He's a full professor in psychology, neuroscience, and behavior, and he is his university's first transgender department chair. The work in his lab is experimental psychology motivated by evolutionary theory. He has developed workshops and has written on the topics of radically inclusive leadership, formal consensus decision-making, and queer etiquette. And I've invited him to be here with us today because I wanted to talk with him about something that I'm really proud of as we enter this time of queer pride, LGBTQIA plus pride. Mel, welcome to my show.
Hi, happy to be here.
Oh, I'm happy to be here too. And I love that you're flying the rainbow flag over there. It's great to have you. Well, do you want to talk a little bit about what we did together 18 years ago? Well, we did a couple of things together.
18 years ago, we had babies. We had some twins and this week they're graduating from high school. And in line with our theme of being a plaintiff in order to get social justice done, we joined a lawsuit that's now known as Rutherford versus Ontario, that was meant to get our names on our children's birth certificates.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting. I'm noticing as you're saying that out loud, like some people just have babies and then they like raise their kids, but sometimes, when you're queer, you get to sue the government in order to, when you have babies. And I think we knew we were going to do that. You could Google this, but we had really unique facts. So we used Mel's eggs before he transitioned. Mel's transgender. And we used his eggs and I carried the baby. So we were both genetic parents of our kids. So we checked all the boxes. We were at the time Americans living in Canada, so we had two countries to try to get birth certificates from, and we actually knew when we decided on this method of getting pregnant, we did IVF, and when we did this, we knew we would probably sue the government in order to change the law. We were legally married when our children were born, and so it felt like dirty pool that we would have to adopt our own biological children at that point.
Yeah, so this was a class action case, and the case had been put together before we joined it. It in the end, it was 4 couples. The other 3 couples were lesbians who had kids, and they had used artificial insemination, and they invited us to join the case because we'd had a biologically sort of stronger case. We'd used IVF. Both of us were biological parents, and it worked out the way they thought it would, in that the government settled our case, our family's case, before the whole class action case went to court. And so they could use our decision as a precedent when they went to court, and in the end they all won. So all 4 of these families the parents got to put their names on their kids' birth certificates, and it became a precedent-setting case. So now in Ontario, when couples choose to use artificial sperm donor to make their families, they get to put their names on their birth certificates.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of like criteria, like you have to be married, and it had to be an anonymous donor. No, not anymore.
Some of these couples weren't married.
Okay.
That's not a requirement.
It's
But,
using an anonymous
but
donor.
yes, it had to be an anonymous donor. If it was a known donor, they did have to go through an adoption.
And I think there may have been cases after hours. We aren't legal experts. We're just like did our little piece of activism in the world. And I think it's important maybe just to talk about, I might just mention, so I was a biological parent because I gave birth, and you were a biological parent because of gametes. And so either of those will establish biological parentage in both the US and Canada, actually. And according to their own internal documents. Do you want to talk about the US, since this is, my podcast?
So the way we made babies was confusing to both Ontario and the US. And Ontario was going to say that you were a parent and I was irrelevant. And then the US was going to say I was the parent and you were not, they were not going to include you in the paperwork. But either of those exclusions is ridiculous. So we had a very strong case going in, and in the United States we did not become plaintiffs. We did not sue the US government. We just sat tight until the administration changed and Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State, and she gave us birth certificates with our names on them.
Yeah,
and so that was much easier, but it wasn't precedent setting. And suing the government of Ontario was harder work, but it was precedent setting. So you kind of have to choose your battles, and the outcome will depend on whether or not you take it to court.
Well, it's so interesting. I think that's such an interesting point. And I think I've always said this was like the easiest activism we ever did. Like we joined an already existing class action suit. Our lawyers worked pro bono. They actually got paid when the government lost their case. So they got paid by the government. This was like the easiest and most flashy sort of activism we ever done. We've done all sorts of activism all over the years, but this one was easy, but it is something that I'm very proud of. And we've had friends who have benefited, so many friends who have benefited from this case. And I also think that there's something about our children. They just got through the process of writing their university applications and doing essays and things like that. And so we had a lot of conversations this year in our family about who they are about this case. So this case, they were plaintiffs in this case, clearly, and yet they had to really figure out like, who are they in all of this? So they were like, well, that's your story, but it's their story.
They were suing the government of Ontario on the day they were born.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. So we were having a conversation with one of our sons this morning as we were driving him to school, and our boys don't have any sort of fear of being perceived as gay, and they're twins. They're tall, they're beautiful, they're athletic, but they don't have. They've been a real lesson to me in what it looks like when kids grow up and they're not trying to prove to the world they're not gay. So there's, they might paint their nails, or my son today went off, it's June 1st, so it's Pride, and he went off in a crop top Pride shirt. And both my boys at this moment, believe they're 100% heterosexual, but claim the title of queer spawn, but they could care less if someone thinks they're gay. So they don't have any behaviors that they're trying to make sure no one thinks they're gay, which makes them very interesting in the world. And I think I'm as proud of that as I am of anything else in this whole lawsuit. So, yeah. Well, we have some very exciting guests to join us. I've invited some very interesting activists to join us in our conversation today. So I am going to introduce them, and I can't wait to extend this conversation. I am super excited to have our guests today. We have Lake James Paraguay, who owns Law Works LLC in Portland, Oregon, and he focuses his legal work on civil rights, plaintiffs' employment and injury claims, constitutional law, and family law. Lake's work includes cases in which families are litigating over custodial rights of trans children, where the party who's granted custody may decide about gender-affirming medical care for the children. Lake obtained the first legal recognition for a non-binary person in the United States, which opened the doors to other states in the District of Columbia following suit, creating identity documentation and driving license regulations for non-binary gender designation. Also, Lake is one of my childhood friends, and I am so excited to have him here. Welcome, Lake.
Hi, Melanie. It's so great to see you, and I'm excited about our conversation today.
Oh, I'm so excited about our conversation. And I also want to welcome Key Strawn, who's worked in education for over 25 years, from teaching ELL learners to kindergartners. And Key is studying to become a psychotherapist with a specific desire to help gender minorities deal with the minority stress and invalidation they face. He is an activist in the transgender community, organizing events and advocating publicly to advance trans rights. They blog about their experiences at www.thekeyhole.ca and perform under the drag name Their Majesty the Queer. Welcome to the show, Key.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm so excited to have this conversation. And happy Pride to everyone.
Yes, happy Pride.
Happy Pride.
Well, I just wanted each of you, we've just talked about our story in Rutherford v. Ontario, and I'd love to hear from you, Lake, about some of the work that you've been doing in the US to start with. Could you tell us a little bit about the human rights work that you've been doing?
Yeah, so I represent sometimes prisoners who have had their constitutional rights violated by guards or by the prison system. I've advocated for transgender people who are in prison, who are seeking to change prisons to, say, maybe from a male prison to a female prison and to be housed with the prison population consistent with their gender. I brought the legal case for marriage equality for the state of Oregon when all the states were kind of moving in that direction. I did that in our state. And then, as you mentioned, one of the bigger cases in my estimation is kind of opening the door legally for gender non-binary people to have legal recognition. And that was, I think, 4 or 5 years ago now. Seems like a long time ago because so many people are identifying as non-binary, but at the time, there were very few people. No one had really ever heard of it. And there was no box on the legal form at the court for gender change that included non-binary. So that's a sampling. And then, like you said, I also represent parents and sometimes kids in custodial determinations in the courts where the stakes are really high because the parent who is granted legal custody will be able to make medical decisions for minors who are seeking gender affirming care.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that sort of overview. And we're going to dive into those things a little more. And Key, I'd love to know kind of a little bit of your journey as a plaintiff, as activist.
You mean specifically the case that we're going to be talking about today, or just in general?
Any of them, more big picture, or what you've been up to, or where, you and I know the reasons that I invited you on this show, but I'd love for us to share that with our audience.
Yeah, well, I gender transitioned around 2015. And in the beginning, I was going as a trans man using he, him pronouns. And then as I moved along in my experience, especially with the negative experiences that I was having with being a teacher in a female-dominated environment and the transphobia I encountered there, I went to a more non-binary presentation just to be safe because I found there was a lot of hostility towards me. And in doing, just coming along with transitioning, I had to involve myself with many institutions, like changing my name, changing my legal status. And in so doing, I encountered a lot of cisgender norming, like these systems are made for cisgender people, so people whose identities match their assigned sex at birth. So I found that there was sort of an almost invisibility of trans and non-binary and two-spirit and other gender minority people existing. So I ended up having to very rapidly find out how to fight for my rights And usually I had to take it beyond whatever organization I was working with to confront it. So that would usually be working with I live in Ontario with the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal, and they have a pretty good system for challenging these systems. It's very tedious and it's a lot of hard work, but I found myself doing that with many institutions like the Ontario College of Teachers, various hospitals, and finally the Ministry of Transport and the police, which is probably what we're going to talk about today.
Well, we can certainly talk about that now. So I found it so interesting as we were sort of prepping for this call that Lake had brought forth a case to have people be able to change their documentation to non-binary. And I'd love for you to talk about that case in Ontario for a minute.
Yeah, well, I actually, I wanted to change my license to non-binary because I feel like it's the states has no business or the province has no business in my underpants, basically, and knowing my gender wasn't that important. So I did want to change my license to an X even before I was presenting more non-binary with people, just in solidarity with other gender minorities. So as soon as Ontario allowed it, I think it was in 2017, I changed my license to gender X, and it was quite a procedure. When I did it, a lot of I had to go to an office, and they had to call many people, and there was a whole group of people working there gathered around me. It was very othering to do, but I did it. And I didn't think any more of it. I thought, this is great. We live in an inclusive system. Now I have a gender X on my license. And I didn't really ever have any problems with it until I got a speeding ticket. And then that's when the problems began. I was driving to a doctor's appointment in another city because there's no trans care in my city. And I was late. Excuse me. So I was speeding and I got pulled over, and normal everyday things. The police officer gave me a ticket, and then when he left, I saw that he'd marked my gender, or the computer that he'd ran it through had marked my gender as unknown. And I thought that was very strange because I'd gone through all this extra work of changing my gender marker, and I found it really insulting. So I actually called the ticket office right away, and they informed me that gender unknown was for people who had driven through stop or traffic lights, and they'd taken a photo, and because they wouldn't know their gender, they just put gender unknown. And I explained, well, but I was pulled over, the police officer saw my license, and he knew my gender, and why is it marked gender unknown? And they couldn't tell me why. And I couldn't get them to change it. So it really bothered me because the next step would be going to court and speaking with the prosecutor, trying to get a deal. And I would have to openly discuss my gender and out myself as a trans person in court. So it became very scary very soon for me. And I think that I'm glad I didn't have anything else going on when the police pulled me over, because I'm not sure what would have happened if they had have arrested me. For example, if I had something illegal in my car, like what would they have done? I would have probably been outed. Maybe I would have been put into the wrong area because, gender is important to the police because of housing there at the jail. So I was very concerned, and I didn't want to get it changed because I thought, well, how come I'm invisible in this system? This is a problem.
Mm. And
so what happened? Oh my goodness. Well, this happened, this started in May 2019, and I only resolved it in 2022. So the police managed to misgender me for almost 3 years. I did an official complaint to the Office of the Police Review Board, and I had to go in and talk to them about my gender and being trans and why it was important. And they refused to change the gender. And they insisted on letting the ticket stand because they felt the ticket was more important, and speeding was more important than my gender identity as a human being. And then so I had to go to the Human Rights Tribunal and sue the Ministry of Transport and the police. And before you get to court, they have a mediation, and the Ministry of Transport admitted wrongdoing. So I was able to settle with them. However, the police said, this is the fault of the Ministry of the Transport, and it's not our fault, and we're not going to remove the ticket, and we're not going to do anything. So even though the Ministry of Transport admitted it was a problem and it was their fault, and they settled with me, the police continued to insist that I show up in court and argue this ticket, saying that I'm gender unknown. And I'd even gone to visit the prosecutor. His name is Sean Ramage, and he said, you could quote me, like, sex is irrelevant to getting traffic tickets. And I was thinking, well, why did I have to go through all that work to change my gender indication on the license? And why is it even on tickets if it's irrelevant? So that statement was just a statement of privilege. It's like people who say, I don't see gender, I don't see race when you're a white person. Like they just have so much privilege, they have no idea that it is relevant. They just don't notice because they're privileged and their gender, their assigned gender at birth matches who they are. And so it doesn't stand out to them. So what ended up happening in the end was my lawyer, David Shellnut, worked pro bono, and he said that I'm not going into court and arguing my gender. He would do it for me. And he contacted the prosecutor, and the prosecutor wanted to continue and had no idea why this was a problem or that it was causing me mental dysphoria or upset, being misgendered for 3 years. And then when the day came for him to be in court, the police officer didn't show up. So the ticket was not able to be argued. So that's how the police handled it. They maintained and doubled down on the misgendering right up to the very end. And so I didn't actually have to argue the ticket, and it was quashed simply because they refused to show up and argue it.
And I mean, there might be listeners who aren't super savvy about issues like this. And this is a question for everyone, because I think everybody will have their own answers for this. But I mean, this wasn't an expensive ticket. I mean, and you had a way to pay it.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
What's important about not backing down, like taking the path of least resistance? Why didn't you take the path of least resistance on this?
Well, one thing I've noticed particularly about being a transgender person is that society is built to render gender minority people invisible. So when a trans person or a two-spirit person or a non-binary person shows up, it's usually some sort of social emergency. They're not included on forms. They're not included in government documentation. There's no washroom for them often. And so there's a sense of invisibility. And I really see that rendering minorities invisible as part of transphobia, but also I know it happens to other minority people too. So I feel like it's important for my voice to be heard because I'm aware there's a long history of erasing gender non-binary people who've always historically existed. And I feel like it shouldn't happen to other non-binary people who, everybody gets tickets for something or other, and they should, if they're paying taxes and they're getting tickets and they're participating in society and being required to have the obligations of living in our society, they should also be recognized as equals.
Mm. And Lake, I'd love to invite you to weigh in on why you've done some cases that not the path of least resistance. And congratulations, by the way, on the same-sex marriage and the changing of documentation. Those are powerful human rights changes. But why put yourself out there?
Well, I put myself out there, but so do the plaintiffs. These are oftentimes activists who want to change something for themselves, but many of them and most of the people that I've represented really have a compassion for other people, and they see that the structures of government or even individuals who have harmed them in some way will continue to do that so if unchecked. But the fact is that without a lawyer, they're not really going to get anywhere. So in my case, I'm very privileged. I'm white, male, healthy, educated, with no debt, and no children. So I have the capacity to play in this lane. It's exciting. There are high stakes, and I can really make some change. And also, I actually can get paid in some of these, but it's a deferred kind of payment because oftentimes plaintiffs as activists, if they're rich and powerful, if it's Peter Thiel, he's not going to get screwed around with. He's a billionaire gay, right? But a lot of people who are sexual minorities or other minorities, they get picked on or they get undermined either intentionally or structurally, and they oftentimes don't have the power to hire a lawyer at $400 or $500 an hour to litigate a case that's going to take a year or longer. So I get to be in a position where I can defer payment or maybe not even get payment to help push society along, and it's just fun. It's kind of fun for me sometimes. Other times I don't want to look at the computer or look at paperwork, and I don't care about the plight of other people, but more often than not, I do. So.
Mm.
Mhm.
And Mel, do you want to weigh in here?
Yeah, so we were talking about being a plaintiff and the role of the plaintiff in social justice. And we've talked about the Rutherford versus Ontario case. And recently I've become a plaintiff again. I've experienced some pretty significant transphobia in the workplace. And for a variety of reasons, some of which I don't understand, the leadership in my institution hasn't been able to create a supportive workplace for me. So I've again become a plaintiff. And we were thinking about why some of the reasons that somebody might have to become a plaintiff. Why is that the right decision at a particular moment? And one of the things that I've noticed is that it sometimes is necessary when there's a power imbalance, and that's kind of the situation I'm in my workplace. You and I have been listening to Loretta Ross and Lone Tran talking about calling in culture, creating a calling in culture where instead of calling somebody out, you have a more gentle and more constructive conversation that sort of corrects someone's behavior and maybe educates and creates understanding without shaming somebody or calling somebody out, which I think you and I both hold as an ideal and a value, but it's really difficult to bring to a power imbalance when you're dealing with somebody who's got power over you. I've found that you sometimes don't have the opportunity to have that constructive calling in conversation. And with that, I've found actually a feeling of disappointment in myself, a feeling of like I wasn't able to harness my skills to create a constructive relationship. 2 years ago, when I came into the position I hold now, I really felt confident that I knew how to create constructive relationships. You find the common values and goals, and then you build from there. And I've utterly failed to create a constructive relationship. I found my approach completely fruitless in this situation across a power imbalance. And, I found that to be disappointing, but that's where I am. And so I'm using the position as plaintiff to redirect the conversation or focus some awareness.
Well, and I want to just mention something, and that is you may have been unable to build that relationship up, but you very effectively built it down. I think that you actually have 100% approval rating within the people that you supervise, which is highly unusual for any leader. And I've always said, we've been together for a very long time now, and I've always said that I sort of know it's transphobia when it is weird and it doesn't make sense. It's like you're going along doing life, and then something just bizarre happens, and you logically try to figure it out, and then you're like, what just happened? I remember years ago we had a bed and breakfast, and we had these guests, and they were like gushing over how excited they were to be here and how beautiful the room was, and they loved it so much, and they were so excited. And then they saw our family pictures, and at that time Mel presented fairly gender ambiguous, and all of a sudden they had headaches and had to leave. And so it was, and I was like, and I kept saying, like, why do they have headaches? Really? They got sick in our house? Do we have a problem? Like, do we need to get somebody to clean our ducts? Like, what's going on? And I think you were like, Melanie, they saw our family pictures. So it's often the weirdest things that are happening that are the signal for it to be something, because nobody comes to you and goes, hey, dude, I hate you because you're trans. Although I think you had somebody say something like that to you in college, but nobody says that. So it's always some weird thing that you've gotten wrong is the way that it appears. You are wrong because of blah, 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 which is, it's so hard to get your feet. So I think it's really interesting to look for how it plays out. And it sounds like, Key, you were treated that way in your case. Like, what is wrong with you? Why won't you just pay the ticket? Are you and they treat you like you're trying to get out of, I don't know, how much was that ticket?
It was like a $200 ticket.
Yeah. So are you so ridiculous that you won't just pay $200? You'll go through years of fighting to have your gender recognized. Like, what are you trying to get away with? So then you become almost criminal. Well, all you're trying to do is get them to recognize the thing you put on your driver's license.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the police still have managed to uphold the misgendering of me as well. Like, they were so determined. If they actually had changed the ticket, which they're allowed to do, I would have had to pay the ticket. And they would have had the best of both worlds, which would be that they corrected something and they, and did the law as well, like they did their job. I find that when I first transitioned, I thought transphobia looked a certain way too. And then I started realizing about microaggressions, and I called it inside thoughts. I could always tell the inside thoughts that people were having, the really highly unusual way they were acting with me, and the strange things they would say to me. Like, they made it really weird. I actually think cisgender people can be really weird in a way that transgender people never could be, because we're quite upfront about what we're doing and who we are, usually. And I think a lot of it has the importance of having the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal. And I don't know how it is in the States for Lake, but every province has some sort of tribunal to challenge systems because of privilege. And people have so much gender privilege, they're not even aware of how different it is when you don't fit in. And they know that pointing out someone's gender is actually a weird thing to do, because normally you just accept someone for who they are. So anytime you're pointing out something about someone that's usually unspoken, that gets uncomfortable and weird for everyone. And I've also noticed that there's a lot of focus on, well, my intentions were good. I had such good intentions. And the good thing about the Human Rights Tribunal and human rights in general is it's the impact. It looks at the impact on the person who it's happening to. So you could have wonderful intentions and be super positive towards trans people, for example, but you keep talking about it with them and you won't let it go. And you keep making mistakes and talking about why you made those mistakes and apologizing. Well, that becomes harassing to a trans person very quickly, and othering. So, I mean, the focus is on the impact. And I find that was very, very helpful for me accessing those courts. But I'm, like you mentioned, your privilege. I'm privileged too. Like, I have a level of education. I'm a white person. And I live in a province where it's free for me to take these people to court, and I get free legal support, which is amazing. But it's also a huge pain to have to do it. It's very invalidating. And I think that what a lot of people don't understand is it's a traumatic invalidation. Like, if maybe a cisgender person was misgendered, they would be annoyed or upset, but it doesn't happen to them like every day for almost all their life. And it doesn't cause them to have dysphoria and mental health issues like it would a trans person.
I'm curious for everyone to sort of weigh in on, when do you know it's time to become a plaintiff or to file a lawsuit, in your case, Lake, and what's the thing you bump up against, or how do you query yourself? How do you think about that?
Well, when it came to the gay marriage case, that one was, I had been thinking about that my entire life, and saw that as a obvious development in the law since Loving versus Virginia and Separate but Equal and all of these cases in the United States anyway. It just seemed so obvious, even in law school. And so I was, there were some false starts, and I wasn't part of that group of lawyers that were working on those. And then in that particular case, the Supreme Court had decided that a prior case in the US called Windsor, the Windsor decision, and that involved a woman who had been married to a Canadian woman under New York law. And the question there was whether her estate was going to be taxed by the federal government because her wife had died. And normally under American law, when your spouse dies, you're not taxed. Everything goes to you, and it's a tax-free situation. So you had lesbians, which everybody loves, and taxes, which everybody hates. And so it was a great case. And that was Roberta Kaplan handled that case. And she's the one who just won the big verdict against Trump in the United States. In any event, the one for sexual assault and defamation. In any event, in that case, it just like that was something I had worked on. I'd been arrested protesting the Texas sodomy laws that were later overturned by the US Supreme Court in the Lawrence v. Texas case. So I was, had my body on the line in this Texas state legislature for that law, which later was at the Supreme Court. And then before the Windsor decision, I was actually in the Supreme Court the week before. So I was really riding that zeitgeist in a particular way. And then I just knew that it was the right time, but I didn't have a plaintiff. And it took conversations actually with the Attorney General in Oregon for me to meet up with a plaintiff. One of the Attorney General employees actually lived across the hall from a couple who later became my plaintiffs. So there, I kind of put that together. It was really my vision that was kind of pushing it. In other cases, someone will come to me and I have to make a determination. Do I want to take this case? I can easily file a case in a day, but then I'm stuck with it. They're very sticky. Oftentimes people don't have money. So I'm funding this, dreaming about it, thinking about it, doing all the work. And the plaintiffs are just back there like, oh, my lawyer called and I've got this great case, and it's all cocktail party chat for them. And it's also like their lives and very real. But I'm doing all the work, really. So I have to decide, do I want to take on this work or do I want to pass and maybe somebody else will do it? But there is an urgency sometimes because there aren't a lot of people who are doing this kind of work, and they've talked to 20 other lawyers and no one wants to do it. And people are in law firms and they don't want to support this for whatever reason. So it's a complex determination. Oftentimes it's just, do I feel lazy today or, angry and empowered and rah! And I said, as I get older, I'm less like, rah! And more, oh. So, but I have a lot of young people that I tutor and promote and encourage to get into the fight.
Anybody else want to weigh in on when it's time to become a plaintiff?
Yeah, I think that I was really good goading on Mel in some instances in his life, but I know to become a plaintiff, usually I try to, I have a religious belief too. So I have there's a system in my religion where you have to confront the person and then you go to the person above them. And then, you try to resolve it in steps. So I always try to progress. So whenever I sue someone, it's never going to be a surprise to them, because I will mention it very quickly. Like I'll say, this is not in tune with the Ontario Human Rights Code, and here's what I need to see happen. More training, or you need to correct these documents to include me, or this person did this and they need training. And usually what happens is I find nobody ever thanks me for pointing out their privilege or pointing out problems in their system. And usually what happens is they say that they're going to take action and then they don't, or they don't take it very seriously. So then I have to escalate it. So if I have to escalate and I don't get results, that's when I know I have to look at taking them to the Human Rights Tribunal, because I feel like if I mention it once, it's so clearly a human rights violation, they should just fix it immediately. And it's good for whatever business or company or organization I'm dealing with. It's actually quite good for them to have that progressive spirit about them. It's going to be welcoming to more people. A lot of people who have LGBTQ and two-spirit people in their lives see these little hints and signs that it's welcoming as positive. It's actually really has a good effect on the younger population. I'm always surprised at the institutions who fight me back, though. It's really shocking. They're usually like, we're doing a great job. Why are you so ungrateful? There's a whole thing like, you should be grateful that we're even tolerating you as a trans person right now, Yeah.
And Mel, you talked about power imbalance. Is there anything else you want to add here?
Well, I mean, for me, in both the examples that we've talked about today, there was really a feeling of urgency, and it was different in the two cases. So in the most recent case, I felt that I wasn't safe. I wasn't safe at work, and it felt urgent that I do something about that. I didn't feel like anybody else was going to fix that problem and create safety for me. So it felt urgent that I do that. And in the Rutherford versus Ontario case, the idea that I wouldn't be related to my own children was absolutely unacceptable. So something had to be done. So very different situations, but in both cases, a feeling of urgency.
Mhm.
Well, and I think, yeah, with Rutherford v. Ontario, I mean, we didn't have a different path. It was clear that in order to parent our children, we knew before we got pregnant that we would sue the government in order to change the law.
Yeah, I have to say that Lake's comments were really resonating with me with respect to the Rutherford versus Ontario case, because we were like mostly lying in bed during the whole time we were suing the government of Ontario.
But that was like the easiest when we joined a class action, and yeah.
The lawyers were working hard, and we were like, oh yeah, the lawyers are calling. Let's talk to them again.
we were raising baby twins. So I think that was interesting. I also think about like times that we get these sort of weird things that happen that are completely either homophobic or transphobic. And like when we were trying to get pregnant, we actually were given documents where we would have both signed away our parental rights. So they gave me the gestational carrier documents and Mel the egg donor documents. And we would have literally, and what I said to them was, who will raise the children?
Yeah.
And whoever the, like $15 an hour person who was handing us the forms was like, well, I don't know if we can do the procedure then. And if you know anything about IVF, this was like a hugely expensive procedure. And I was like, maybe you should go talk to somebody else. I didn't sue anybody over that. I was annoyed, and it's a great cocktail story, and it exemplifies what it's like to be queer, but that didn't meet that criteria for me to sue someone. We were such an anomaly in their system. I didn't feel like it would protect that many people for us to sue them over that. So for me, that one wasn't one that made me a plaintiff. But to actually, yeah, go ahead, Lake.
I like this notion of calling in, because sometimes, I mean, with a variety of different cases, sometimes I'll just file the lawsuit, but other times I'll send a letter and be really not conciliatory, but just say, this is what's happening to my client, or this is what's happening in this situation, and are you open to communicating about it? And
I think that's a great example of calling in.
Yeah, it's great. And I mean, people don't get defensive. There's not a lawsuit there. Sometimes maybe I'll draft the lawsuit and just say, hey, can we call this in? Otherwise, here's your name and the caption, right? But I have one story about that. Just anecdotally, there was a person who came to me, and they had gotten all of their identity documents changed, and they had legally changed their gender from male to female. But the one thing that was left was their life insurance policy. And so I just called someone at New York Life about it and got someone on the phone. And the issue, though, there was that the mortality tables for women are, women at birth are different than men at birth. And so women actually have a longer lifespan, so they pay less per month for the same life insurance. And so that's a permissible discriminatory pricing scheme based on the actual aerial tables of people's lives. But I asked him, well, what is the life expectancy of a trans person? And he's like, oh, well, actually, I don't know. And so I was like, you don't know, and there isn't any data there, and you're not basing it on that at all. And so, a trans woman is different, maybe has a different actuarial lifespan. So they just agreed to change it without litigation. And they gave my client a refund because they had charged her under the male rate for so long. And so they got a big refund, and then they just agreed to change it. And they didn't agree at that point to change it company-wide because it had never even come to them. But in that instance, we called it in, and they were happening to have a board meeting that week, and were really interested in this topic. And that was a positive, simple. And in the non-binary case too, it was very simple. I didn't have to do a big litigation. It was before all the culture wars in America were happening. So nobody had ever heard of a non-binary person. And, that was great. But then after that, then so many other states started it. And so calling in is great. I like it.
So I have a question for you all to sort of finish this, off. And that is, what is something, and it doesn't have to be the most proud of, but what are you proud of that you've done as around, these legal issues around activists, plaintiff as activists? What's something you're proud of?
Well, I can say Rutherford versus Ontario because it was precedent setting, and now families have been able to use it. In fact, some families who are in our friendship group have used this, and their kids, and they're now related to their kids because they used the precedent that we set in Rutherford versus Ontario.
I guess I'm a lot of the battles that I've had, we've ended up mediating and settling. So they haven't actually made it to court, which is a little problematic because there's not a lot of precedent or legal precedent in Ontario around trans issues. But I think what I'm most proud of is just that my other trans friends see me doing this. And I can help them now if they need to go to the Human Rights Tribunal. It's a very tedious process and I hate doing it. I'm most proud that I continue to do it because people have the idea that you get a lot of money and you actually don't. They're very low awards. And but I'm most proud because I usually ask for a public remedy, which is forcing a company to train their employees, forcing them to change policy. So I know that I've silently influenced in a lot of the education sector, the Ontario College of Teachers, and a lot of hospitals, and now the Ministry of Transport. Right. So I know that I have sort of a backdoor way of changing things, but not a lot of people know I've actually done this and how many cases I've done. And I have a lot more coming up, but part of me is like, I should start blogging. I should probably this is all public record. So I should put these things on public record so people can see. Absolutely. A lot of personal details about me are in there as well, but I think in the future, I'm going to start sharing some of my cases so that people can see what crazy level of problems there are for non-binary and trans and two-spirit people.
Mm-hmm. I guess I would say I'm most proud that I still and have been consistently willing and interested in this kind of work, because it doesn't, I mean, it's not, I'm not that interested in money and getting power, but I am interested in changing the world for the better a little bit. I mean, it really is. It's maybe sounds a little hokey, but that's kind of how I'm motivated. So giving back, as my mom told me, who Melanie met when we were young.
Yeah, and I think
we were thespians together.
Not
nobody knew that you were thespian.
Yeah.
They did. They really did, actually.
Oh, they did.
Everyone knew we were thespians.
Yeah, thespians together. I think that a huge part of what happens is traumatic invalidation when you're in systems that render you invisible. And I think that I'm also just most proud of the fact that I refuse to let people render me invisible and render my community invisible. Because I know that a lot of my friends are tolerating it and it happens to them. And I actually consistently fight that. And I think it's important that my voice as a non-binary trans person is heard.
And I think if I weigh in here, like, I'm kind of proud of Rutherford v. Ontario. Like, I'm happy we did it. But I think some of the things I'm most proud of is like people with trans kids will, bring their kids to swim in our pool. And like, we had one instance where they were like, oh, our kid's changing their name this week and you're the first ones to, try it. And our kids will be like, okay. And they call that kid that name and that pronoun on that day. And then the same people came back on, 3 days later, but they came with another family and they're like, whoops, we got to go back to the old name because we haven't told them. And my kids are like, okay, just keep us in the loop. Tell us what name it is. And so I'm just like, the thing I'm most proud of, I think, is the comfort my family has around trans issues. And also like, they have deep compassion because they've grown up around this. They have like, there's been a lot of hugs in our house this year, and they are aware that things are happening, and they claim a queer spawn identity, which I think is really cool. And I think they deserve that identity. They are very comfortable with all this. And I think by being willing to take on a lawsuit, by talking about it, by having friends talk about it, by having friends in our lives that are out and have safe places to come out, we've created space. And I think I'm most proud of that space. And I'm also proud that I'm still thinking about calling in, even though Mel's filed a lawsuit. Like, we're still having that dialogue. We're not just one thing, we're all the things. So I guess that's what I'm proud of. I have one more question.
Before you, I just wanted to say though, about creating a safe space. When I started transitioning, so I actually taught Mel and Mel's kids in kindergarten before transitioning, and they were a huge support to me when even when I was teaching them, I wasn't aware I was a trans person. So when I finally did figure that out, they were a huge support to me as well. Invaluable, actually. We met a lot at that time, and I received a lot of support from them. So I can definitely chime in on that. That is something you should be proud of, and it's something that I'm very grateful for.
Yeah,
Thanks.
That'll make me cry. Okay, I have one more question, which is because we need, I still want us to end on an activist, fiery note, just not a kumbaya note, but a fiery note. So confidentiality agreements, what do you think?
I'll say first that they have a significant value, and I find that a lot of defense counsel, whether it be in the employment discrimination context, they say, oh, well, these are standard. We're not talking about big civil rights cases against the state. In my particular state, if the money that's being given is being given by the public trust and it's tax money, there's a prohibition on confidentiality. So that's not maybe the same in every province or state or country. But so my point is they have value. And so if somebody wants you, if they harm you in the first place, and then they want to wire your mouth shut after that, that is very expensive. So don't give away confidentiality agreements freely. Make them pay. They're often taxable in a way that other settlements are not. And in the US anyway, confidentiality agreements are being legislated out of existence little by little by little. So I don't like them. I mean, if you want to keep it private, then maybe you want to encourage that. But
I'll say I'm not just a trans man. I'm also a scientist. So I don't like hiding the data. I want these stories to be told so that we can all look at them and analyze them and understand what's happening here.
Exactly. Yes, 100%.
Yeah, and I think that confidentiality agreements usually silence the voice of the people who don't have a voice normally. And then this person spoke up, and then you're going to silence them by paying them off a huge amount of money. So I don't like them either, but they do still exist here in Ontario, and most settlements are damages, which are tax-free here. I don't think public institutions should be able to do confidentiality agreements, especially if they're using public money. And I think we're starting to see that with the Canada Hockey Organization. They had a whole bunch of confidentiality agreements against the sexual abuse cases that came, and sexual assault cases. I hope in the future it's going to go away, because I think unions hide their failure to protect their employees. And I think that a lot of public places with public employees also hide their treatment and how they're spending the money of the taxpayers. That's all I can really say about that. But yeah, I don't like them.
It has been such a joy to be with all of you. Thank you so much for giving me your time. I've been fascinated by so many of the things that we've talked about. It's just been so lovely to dive into this topic and to think about this whole idea of plaintiff as activist, and just thank you from the bottom of my heart.
It's been fun. Thanks.
Thank you.
Nice.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of The Experimental Leader. We hope you have found value in today's episode, because we're dedicated to helping you become the experimental leader you want to be. To access the show notes or learn more about working with Melanie, visit melanieparish.com. Go experiment.